we did talk a little bit about the church. For hundreds of years leading up to the Enlightenment, the church kind of controlled all aspects of life in terms of education, the way you live your life, the rules and laws. And the radicals came along in the Enlightenment and had this radical point of view that they want a clear separation of church and state.
Right. That was the radical enlightenment concept that Jefferson was so taken with.
Exactly. And looking at the founding of America, a lot of people say that in America we have a separation of church and state. A lot of people say that America is built on Judeo Christian values. How do you draw the line when it comes to the founding of America between those two?
This is a fascinating topic, and I could make an argument that in many respects American history has been this tension, this push and pull between between the notion of a civic bottom up forming of America based on uh, national rights versus a more top down religious oriented one that, as you mentioned, based on Judeo Christianity. And I think there's elements of both. Certainly both have played a role. But if we're fair to history and if we're accurate, most of the founders, as you probably know, were deists. They believed very much in a separation of church and state, and many came from an environment through their ancestors in Britain where religion was very much regulated, if you will, or at least it was very prejudicial. So they really believed in freedom of religion as part of a founding metric for the U.S. for this new country. I think that this tension between them is interesting in many respects. I'll give you one interesting example. The the founding period maybe was from the 1770s to 1790s was maybe the most secular period of our history. Soon after, at the end of the turn of the century, there was a movement called the Second Great Awakening, which was very much a religious movement that was very important for many reasons. I mean, it did many wonderful things. For example, it was the first time that women got actively involved in what we would call political issues because they would go to um, these meetings, these outdoor meetings where they would learn about morality, about what are the great issues of the day. Of course, was slavery, and much of the abolition movement took off through the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, as did things like uh, uh, you know alcohol. I forget the name of the term, but in other words, there were many people who were against drinking and making alcohol
Prohibition?
prohibition. But before there was another term from the 18th century, I can't think of. But yes, it led to prohibition. But there was basically women were complaining that many of their husbands were abusing alcohol and getting violent, and so there was a real movement for prohibition at that point as well. My point being, the Second Great Awakening brought new voices into the discussion, which was very powerful. But at the same time, the Second Great Awakening did recast the founding of America in a bit of a revisionist light. And what I mean by that is, as America became increasingly quite religious and devout, there was a famous painting, for example, at that time, which portrayed a picture of God handing the Constitution down to General Washington as tablets. Now, so this is ironic in many respects. Of course, that allusion to the Exodus from Egypt, which is such a strong Judeo-Christian concept, it was really not the thinking behind how the Constitution was formed, which was a bottom-up document of we the people. Furthermore, while the Ten Commandments are set in stone, the Constitution was not supposed to be set in stone. My point being is that at the turn of the century, there was this revisionist view that America was a godly country, that we were kind of a divinely inspired, and I think that notion affected a good part of the 19th century, the early 19th century, and even comes back, of course, in the 20th century. So there's been a pendulum-like swing between these polarities, between the importance of kind of civic ideals from a philosophical perspective, and yet the morality of religious-based concepts grounded in Judeo-Christian religion. One great example I think we can't help but think about is one of our greatest social change leaders, Martin Luther King, was grounded both in was deeply grounded in religion and spirituality and faith, as well as a very strong moral philosophy. And he married the two. So I'm not saying they're conflicting necessarily. Sometimes they can be report, reinforcing. But in terms of our model of government, this notion of bottom up of the people versus kind of a top down divine thing, that's where they do conflict a bit. And we've had a lot of push and pull therein.
That's a wonderful aspect of the book that you lace throughout the entire book is this idea of the pendulum swing, which I want to get into later. I want to flesh that out deeper. But speaking of the Second Great Awakening, this kind of came off of the coattails of the counter enlightenment movement, which came off the coattails of the radical and moderate enlightenment movement. So I do want to talk a little bit about this counter enlightenment movement. What exactly was this ideology?
Well, it's very interesting. Counter enlightenment was not necessarily tied to religion, but it often became so. Let me explain. So there was a movement following the 18th century, the second half of the 18th century, when the Enlightened movement, again, for your listeners to remind them, the Enlightened movement was this incredible awakening of an interest in reason, science, empirical data, the idea to solve problems using our God-given skills of reasoning and empirical observation to be able to make our lives better. So it was a huge period of let's call it rationality. Sometimes it's called reason.
So sort of like an objectivist point of view.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Now there was a pushback, right away. There was a pushback at the time, which became what in cultures but called the Romantic movement, and you saw it in music, in writing, where many writers and artists push back that viewing the world in such a calculated, scientific, rational way was missing the miracle of humanity. And many of them related that to religion, of course, and faith. So the counter enlightened movement basically just means that it rejects the Enlightenment. And it does so from various points of view. There was at the time, Edmund Burke, an important philosopher in Britain, he was a counter enlightener, not so much from a religious perspective, but he thought the counter enlightenment and its focus on reason and the individual invariably uh, harmed the idea of community and of working together as a society. So he critiqued the Enlightenment from another perspective. In the US, the Enlightenment was critiqued often based on a counter Enlightenment that was driven by faith. In other words, that if we assume that all the answers lie in reason and rationality, we we give up the idea that faith and morality is God given, and that was definitely aspect of the counter enlightenment. And I think it had both positive and negative effects on American history. I go through this in the book. For example, one of the most amazing things about the importance of faith and counter enlightenment movement was the way in the US, especially this new country, expanded into thousands, hundreds of thousands of community churches all across the country, which became really, in some senses, the civic square. They became important centers of discussion about issues. So, yes, they were grounded in religion and faith, but they also became kind of the center of community in so many parts of America. And notice that they were decentralized, right? These were all in individual communities. So they were a powerful mechanism in a Jeffersonian sense of decentralized government, decentralized discussion. So, in that sense, this counter Enlightenment movement was very positive. On the other hand, I think there were moments when there has been in our history an attempt, and a sometimes successful one, to tie one religion to the state, or give that religion access to leaders in a way that is counter to what our founders wanted. They really wanted a wall between the two. So I think religion has also played a negative role in terms of civic affairs by using its influence inappropriately. And I don't think this is one of those issues, Jacob, that's complex, right? You have to really understand the different sides of it. I think faith. There's no question that faith and religion, whatever persuasion, is a foundational aspect of so many American lives. But in my view, it's always a balance. There has to be a balance between, faith and the the parts of the miracle of human life and our world that are not really explainable, but the parts where that are rational and explainable, where we can advance and improve life. So the balance between those is in some ways a balance between kind of an enlightenment perspective and a more counter enlightenment perspective.
It's such a complicated issue, and I love talking about the impact and the influence of church on society. It's something that I often grapple with, and I love discussing sort of the philosophical aspect of it. I'm a Christian, so that's my belief, but I love talking about the philosophical aspect and its impact on society. I believe that church is very important on a local community level for the reasons you mentioned about it sort of builds community, fosters community, it gives people a common set of values. And there is the negative aspect of it that you did touch on in the book, and that's something I want to get into a little bit later with neoliberalism later on in American history. But sort of a philosophical question for you, and this is one that Dolbach talks a little bit about: is morality and a universal moral code possible without institutions like the church? Is it's such a fascinating question to me. I personally don't think you can have a universal moral code without an institution, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So this has been a question that's confounded philosophy for quite a long time. In the Enlightenment, there was a great difference of opinion about it. So somebody, just as an example, someone like Dolbach probably, thought that there was a universal code that applied to all human beings, where someone like Voltaire or Montesquieu or some of the moderate enlighteners very much believed that different parts of the world had different, in fact, they often tied it to things like climate, had different needs, and that it wasn't universalist. So just for your listeners, Enlightenment philosophers themselves were very, of very various points of view regarding this question. But I think if you look deeply in philosophy, you have a philosopher going back to the early Enlightenment like Spinoza. And Spinoza very much makes a philosophical case for morality being part of a rule. Like it's almost like rules of nature, where he ties it into what could be like what he called God. So, in other words, the notion of in other words, there's a logical reason. The best logical reason of a moral code that's universal in your language, to make this simple, has to be Kantian. Do unto others as you want them to do unto you. So Kant, Immanuel Kant, famous Enlightenment philosopher, his writing, and he was brilliant, very much argued that there is in fact a non-religious or a non-institutional way of thinking about arriving at a moral code. And his golden rule would be the best example in simple terms. I think there were many. If you look like at C.S. Lewis or, excuse me, other thinkers and writers over the course of history have argued very differently. So I think this is the jury's out on this one. I certainly believe that we've seen so much violence and horror in the world over its history, and even in our short lives on the planet, that it's hard to argue that whether it's religious institution or some kind of authority, or it's a kind of a bottom up rational based morality, we haven't succeeded at really achieving it in many ways, right? I mean, it's our track record. I mean, and you have to also, you can't not notice that many of the bloodiest wars were fought over faiths of religion, going back to the Crusades. And even today, one could make the case, and many have, that there is a clash of civilizations between a more fundamentalist Islamic society and a Judeo-Christian one, and this is playing out in Europe. So there's no question that religion, on one hand, has been a fundamental purveyor of morality, yes, as an institution, but it's also caused a lot of violence. So it's to your point, it's not an easy question, and I wonder about this as well. I think, though, for your listeners, you can definitely find philosophers that try to tie it together. The best two examples would be, I think, Kant and Spinoza, which definitely made the case for both a rational view of morality, why it made sense for individuals in order to be in a social contract to operate morally, as well as a faith-based case.
And it goes back to that pendulum swinging, that over history there's sort of this push and pull between religious institutions and sort of that ground up um, democratic view of morality, I guess is a decent way to put it.
I mean, at the end of the day, you mentioned you being a Christian. I mean, to me, when you look at the teachings of Christ, and going back to the Sermon on the Mount, in this religious tradition, there's nothing as moral as what the teachings of Christ were. They were extremely, by almost any definition, they were kind of a moral code. Wouldn't you agree? And I guess many religions have that, but all religions that have that are often, there's a lot of hypocrisy in terms of how they implement stuff today, right? They don't always follow the real teachings of for example, Christ, or even in the Quran. I'm not an expert, but there's been a lot of discussion about how the elements of the Quran have been misused and misinterpreted, etc.
It's such a fascinating conversation. I mean, anything where even these brilliant minds, these philosophers throughout history have grappled with these ideas and debated these ideas. It's just permeated throughout all of history. It's such a fascinating discussion.